Paid sick days have been on the radar for almost a year now during the COVID-19 pandemic. You might have seen on Twitter news stories from political groups discussion around this, and it's a problem Barrie politicians have spoken out about as well. Mayor Lehman has voiced his support for paid sick day policy. But the situation is at an impasse, and that's at Queen's Park. As Doug Ford says, there is no need to duplicate the federal sick day benefit program, which grants Ontarian workers $450 a week for up to 2 weeks. But many critics say that policy in that program isn't enough. It doesn't address critical key details and key realities that workers face. And in a city like Barrie, with a high percentage of college students, frontline workers, and multiple COVID-19 outbreaks at long-term care homes, the issue of paid sick days is just as relevant here as it is anywhere. To help me wade through the subject, I spoke with Sheila Block. She's a senior economist for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Here's our conversation on paid sick days and on Ontario's approach to handling the economic impacts of COVID-19. First off, could you just introduce yourself and your role with the Centre for Policy Alternatives?
So my name is Sheila Block, and I'm Senior Economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Ontario office. And my work focuses mostly on labour markets and public finance.
And when people hear the word or the terms paid sick days, they might think, well, I have paid sick days in my profession, in my role. I'm compensated if I have to stay home sick, but that's not really the conversation we're having. Could you kind of give some background on the idea and conversation around paid sick days that's currently happening in Ontario?
So I think that the conversation on paid sick days in Ontario is really inextricably linked to public health concerns. So in 2018, I believe, we had the introduction of 2 paid sick days in Ontario. And what that was, if these were emergency leave days, and if you were unwell or family member was unwell, you could take this time off. And that's a really important standard, I think, for low-wage workers. And at any time, it's important in terms of public health, because I guess the classic example is in the before times when we would all go to a restaurant. You certainly didn't want your food server or your cook having to choose between staying home to keep healthy and putting food on the table. So that question about both people being able to protect their own health and public health just got extremely more acute and more at the forefront of our minds with the advent of COVID. And what we know is that low-wage workers who are working in essential work, and that ranges in everything from some long-term care workers to people who are working in distribution centers and warehouses, to folks who are working in grocery stores, often do not have paid sick days. And if you don't have paid sick days, then again, you do have to make that choice between food on the table, protecting your health, and protecting the health of others. And so I think that's the kind of larger view of it. And I think what's also important to remember is, for the majority of people who can afford to stay home, and so therefore who are higher income workers and who can work from home, they're more likely to have paid sick days. Whereas the people who are out with a greater potential of both being infected and infecting others are less likely, because we know that low income workers are less likely to have paid sick days than high income workers.
And one of the responses that Doug Ford in particular has given to this is that there's a federal program in place, the 2 weeks of, I think it's like $500 a week pre-tax benefit for people that are sick. Is that an effective program? Is that an effective replacement for the concept of paid sick days?
It isn't an effective replacement for a couple of reasons. One of which is it's based on weeks rather than days, right? So it's for an absence of 1 or 2 weeks. The second thing is understandably, when you move a program away from the individual workplace, then So let's say you call your boss, and your boss says to you, and you say, I'm sick, or I've had my COVID alert app has gone off. I have to stay home until I get my test results. That employer will know whether you're at work or not, and how long you're away. Whereas when you're taking in a third party, which essentially that federal government piece is, then you have to have both those kinds of verifications of how you've been, whether you've been sick, those kind of guardrails around it. So that's sort of one piece of it. The second piece of it is sick pay would automatically come on your paycheck, right? So let's say you're sick for 2 days, you get 2 days sick pay. There's no difference in the amount of your paycheck at the end of that week or the 2 weeks or however long you're paid. There's uncertainty for people about whether they'll qualify or not if they go for the with the federal benefit, and there are time lags associated with it. And again, for low income workers that don't have a big cushion, those are really serious limitations.
And it seems like experts like yourself and your center, as well as political parties and advocates across Ontario, are calling for this. Where is the pushback coming from? Why do you think the government is hesitant, and what other parties are opposed to this idea?
I am sometimes surprised at how universal it seems the support for this is. There was an editorial in the Globe and Mail newspaper, not generally thought of as a bastion of left-wing thought, that called for paid sick days in Ontario and the introduction of them. It's quite widespread. Mayors have called for it, everywhere from mayors to health providers to medical officers of health. It remains somewhat mysterious to me of why the Ford government isn't putting this in place. They were elected opposed to these paid sick days, and one of their first acts in office was to reverse them. But I think as a temporary pandemic measure, there are ways in which this government could justify, consistent with its own ideological position of putting these into place. And it really remains a kind of heartbreaking mystery to me of why they have not done so.
And I suppose you already covered this a little bit, but in Barrie in particular, we have a large student population as well. Many people working in long-term care homes. A lot of people would benefit from this paid sick day if it was installed. As far as the ripple effects of how this could help people get back on their feet economically after the pandemic, what sort of difference could it make in the future, in Canada's post-pandemic future?
Well, instituting paid sick days as a permanent measure would absolutely protect low-wage workers and their families. And again, it's the question of not having to make those choices between working sick, which means you're more likely to infect others, be sick for longer, is one question. And the other I guess the other issue is that loss of income when you do actually have to stay home can have a very large impact on low-income families, right? Or low-income individuals. If you don't have a financial cushion, if you don't have those kinds of savings, then losing a week's wages can have a really negative impact, and can have longer-term impacts in terms of housing security, food security, even in terms of what kinds of money you might have to borrow against on your credit card to pay the bills. So I really think it would have a very positive impact on low-income individuals, and a general positive impact on the health of the population.
And as we see the pandemic moving into a full year since lockdowns have started, many kind of economic situations and economic conversations like this are starting to emerge again. And as you mentioned, this has been a long-standing discussion going back far before the Ford government was put into power. Are there other economic discussions that you see kind of reemerging, or economic policies that are kind of coming back, or the importance of them is kind of being explored?
I think we're seeing a number of these conversations that we've had literally for decades, and that haven't been adequately addressed coming to the fore. And so one of those is around employment insurance and the inadequacy of employment insurance pre-pandemic. It was so inadequate that the federal government had to develop a new program within about 6 days. And what we know is that there had been studies and there had been commissions and there had been advocacy all around making employment insurance more accessible for kind of modern working conditions where people don't work full time, full year, to have the employment insurance system more accessible for women, for racialized people, for immigrants, people who are more likely to be precariously employed. And it kind of took this pandemic to, one, require a new program in terms of CERB to be introduced, and then to have some measures and some changes to employment insurance, which in fact address some of those issues.
And do you see programs like CERB, other ways that the government has dealt with some of the economic impacts carrying forward, being installed in the permanent policy going forward of the Ontario government?
So CERB is a federal program, and the employment insurance is also a federal program that has seen some modifications that are currently in until March. I would hope that we would learn the lessons of the pandemic and that we actually would have improvements in terms of paid sick leave, in terms of benefits, in terms of minimum wages, in terms of some of the temporary increase in wages for essential workers that have already been discontinued. I don't think we've seen any signals from the current Doug Ford government that that's going to be the case. But I do think that the public has been made much more aware of how important these policies are. And the pandemic has showed, although its impact has been very unequal, it has showed how many more of us are actually vulnerable than had originally thought. And I would hope that that would kind of move the public to ask for, advocate for, and vote for politicians that would do that, that would make that kind of an expansion.
And this might be an unfair question, but in terms of a broad overview, how would you rate the current Ontario administration in particular? How would you rate their handling of the pandemic insofar as it relates to economic policy?
I guess I would have to rate it as kind of disastrous. And I think what economists have been really clear about is that there can be no economic recovery without public health measures being in place that actually control the virus. And I think the Ford government, in its kind of rejection of the role of government and in its hesitancy and in its kind of moves back and forth in reopening too early, not taking sufficient action in terms of long-term care homes or other areas, I think really clearly has demonstrated that it has not stepped up and done really what we need to do for an economic recovery, and that is to get the pandemic under control. And that is a first and essential step before we can actually move into an economic recovery.
Well, thank you so much for helping me out with this and kind of, informing the conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Great. So nice to talk with you.